Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, welcome to my dining room. I want to just give you a couple of tips as we're getting ready to go through a very different way of taking some notes and filling in an annotated note sheet. I want you to remember, first of all, each line or series of lines may not just contain one word, it may contain a complete thought or a series of words. So keep that in mind as you try to keep up. I'm going to do a very quick presentation for you that is going to revolve around tenement life, factory life, professional sports and leisure, and other activities, social activities that were going on during the Industrial Revolutionary period, as well as assimilation and the contribution of immigrants, taking care of several of the sections that I told you all that you were going to be doing in your small groups. Because time does not permit us to do that particular assignment the way that I wanted you to do it, I'm going to give you a quick recap here. This will also be posted on the Google Classroom, so you can come back and watch it and rewatch it as you have need. You can rewind, you can pause, you can do whatever you need to do to get your annotated notes sheet complete. This will need to be complete, however, by Monday. All right? So with that being said, I want to just start out by talking about the fact that before the Civil War, factories were small. Employers pretty much knew everybody that worked on their factory floors. It was more of a sense of a community, if you will. But then we also know that this age of industry brings along with it the growth of business, as well as greater ways for businesses to be organized. So as giant industries became the norm, millions of new workers are now going to be needed to work on these assembly lines and to create these new products. The three major categories of workers during this time period included: 1, immigrants; 2, native-born whites; and 3, African Americans. These are the three major subgroups of people who are going to be flooding industry and factory life at this particular time period. Some women had men, some women. Some industries employed more women than they did men. Some of these women made up not only the majority of the workforce, but they also did some pretty tedious jobs. Women worked in textiles. When you hear the word textiles, you should think of fabrics and yarns. They also worked in tobacco factories and in garment sweatshops. Children worked predominantly in textile mills, tobacco factories, coal mines, and also in garment factories. One of the biggest disadvantages here was that these children who worked as child laborers had a little chance to improve their lives because, of course, if you're working, you're not always frequently or readily available to go to school. So their limited education would also become an obstacle to them in the future because they were not going to be able to be smart enough or have enough of the skill needed to advance in their lives. Some of the dangers of factory life we've already discussed. Other things that you need to note: a person could be endangered from breathing in dust and other fibers all day long. People are working 10, 12, and 14-hour days, and oftentimes they're breathing and inhaling some of these things that we found out later could also have been carcinogenic. Just another fancy word for saying very harmful to your health. Textile workers and coal miners often came down with various lung diseases. Think about it. I'm inhaling coal dust, coal ash, smut. This stuff is black. It is the burn off of this chemical. It fills my lungs. I'm breathing it in over time. It produces sicknesses, lung disease, other illnesses like emphysema, make people really, really sick over extended periods of time. Steel workers risked burns and death from coming into contact with big vats or big containers of hot molten metal. Think of it like you do a volcano erupting hot lava. So now picture these humongous vats or containers of molten metal. Think of this red, fiery looking substance. So people are being burned and sometimes are risking their lives and dying. Employers during this time period were not required to compensate workers for their injuries that occurred on the job. There goes workman's comp. There goes you having sick days. There goes you getting injured on the job and your employer paying for your medical expenses. Not a priority, nor was it a requirement at this time period. So would you like to work in these dangerous industries in the early to mid 1800s? I know I wouldn't. Recurring deaths and tragedies led to the greater awareness that safety laws were needed. In the beginning, companies are going to be hiring people to protect their interests. So keep in mind, I'm hiring workers. Also, keep in mind, I have unsafe conditions. People are now seeing how these unsafe conditions are bad for workers. So as they're starting to try to reform, that might be good for the workers, but it might be viewed as bad or negative by companies. So they start to hire private security guards whose number one job or priority was to physically attack strikers or organizers of labor unions who are going to come in and try to make life better for these workers. So they're hiring thugs, if you will, gangsters, mob folk. I'm just using these titles to come in and ensure that these people don't strike and ensure that they don't create these labor unions. Three main goals of labor unions during this time period. One, safer working conditions. Two, higher wages. And three, they also wanted shorter working hours. So these are what the unions are going to be trying to provide or to protect for the people who have entrusted them to serve them. Labor unions at this time had to start as a secret organization. Keep in mind, if people are going to be assaulted or attacked for being a part of labor unions, you're probably going to try to do most of your greatest work underground. So groups like the Knights of Labor, these were a part of the labor union groups forming at this time. They did not use striking as a tactic, but instead they tried to hold public rallies to educate people about the unsafe conditions and things needed to make life better for workers. They admitted women, African Americans, immigrants, and even unskilled workers in their labor unions. They are the only group at this time who would do such. Other groups who came along after them, like the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, would replace them, and they would only admit skilled laborers. They're going to do that because skilled laborers are going to have more of a negotiating position, because they're going to say, you need my specific skill, and they're not other people who have the skill that I possess. So if you want to keep me in your industry, you're going to engage in this process of collective bargaining to ensure that I get what I want so that you get the output that you want. So these are what labor unions like the AFL are going to start focusing on. They're not going to focus on everyone else's issues. They're going to come in and drive a hard bargain with skilled laborers. So let's also talk about tenements. A tenement is a building that is divided into tiny apartments. These tenements are slums, if you will. They're horrible. They're filthy. They're dirty. They're run down in most cases. Many of the poor lived in these buildings, and many of these apartments didn't even have windows. They didn't have heat, nor did they have indoor plumbing. The streets of these slums were often littered with garbage, and there were common outbreaks of cholera and other diseases, which all come as a result of waste and feces and other nasty stuff being prevalent or in the area that people have to live and eat. Almost half of the babies born in these tenements did not live past their first birthday. Settlement houses were created by reformers, women like Miss Jane Addams, who came along to provide some relief to people living in these tenements. A settlement house essentially is a center that is created in order to help the poor. They did things like teach English to immigrants. They provided young people with other alternatives to life, like music and sports. They provided nurseries for young children if their parents were working, to try to make life better for the people who were subjected to these horrible and deplorable conditions. City life during this time isn't just bad. Don't just get a negative idea of it, such as people are thrilled about living, some people are thrilled about living in cities today. Cities offered attractions that did not exist in other places. Downtown shops are not these one-stop shops. Downtown shops are not this place where you go in for one thing anymore. Now they're starting to create department stores. The idea of the one-stop shop, multi-levered or multi-tiered buildings with everything that you can imagine under one roof. What would we call that today? You got it, Walmart. Common entertainment during this time period in cities included museums, orchestras, art galleries, theaters, and circuses. Circuses were a main attraction because everybody wanted to see the lions, the elephants, and other circus animals coming in from foreign places. Central Park, as you may have heard of in New York, was planned in the 1850s, and other cities are now going to follow suit. They're going to come along with parks and zoos and garden areas that are going to allow these urban dwellers and city folk to enjoy the open air outside. Professional sports team did not spring up in cities until after the Civil War. The most popular sport during this time was baseball. Basketball was invented later in 1891. Immigrants. Let's talk very quickly about immigrants, and then this video is through. Jobs pulled immigrants to the U.S. Steamship companies and railroads actually sent agents to Europe and Asia to advertise cheap land and plentiful jobs, brought in a whole lot of immigrants to the U.S. In the late 1800s, populations that were coming into America included Italians from Italy, the Polish from Poland, Russians from Russia, and the Greek from Greece. Italy, Poland, Russia, and Greece. 4 places that a lot of these immigrants were coming from. Travel to the U.S. was miserable. These folk kind of think like the transatlantic slave trade in the Middle Passage. They're crammed onto ships. They're below the deck in places called steerage, where animals are typically kept. It was horrible. 2 of the receiving centers included, as we've mentioned, Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island, which is in the San Francisco Bay. Think California, think out west. Ellis Island, Angel Island. When they got to these centers, they received a very rigorous physical examination. Got to make certain people are in tip-top shape. Why? You're bringing them here to work, so they need to be able to work when they get here. These newcomers did try to maintain many of their traditions from home, but they also tried very hard to assimilate. To assimilate means to become part of another culture, learn the language, learn the traditions, learn the history, etc. Immigrants took on the jobs that nobody else wanted. Some people may say that's a contribution. They eventually started opening their own businesses, and this is also a way that people become introduced to new foods and ways of doing things. An example of that, the Chinese, I'm told, had a magnificent way of doing laundry. So they opened laundering services that also showed people another way to do something that everybody needed to do. So here are just some fast facts that we needed to wrap up immigration as well as the Industrial Revolution. Thanks. Hope you get 100. Prepare for the test.